Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today you join us for a very exciting episode as we are joined by a fellow politics enthusiast, but also far more of a politics expert, we must say, than either me or Diane.
Today we're here with our good friend Daniel, a favourite both of ours and of the sort of channel and the community as a whole. Daniel is our sort of go-to political analyst when it comes to UK and international news. And today we'll be discussing Starmer's first year in office and any new developments in the world of British politics as well. But before we get going, Daniel, can you just give our viewers a quick overview of the last year? How did it start? How did it go? Any highlights? Any lowlights?
Of course. Well, first, thank you, John and Dejan, for having me. Always a pleasure to be on. So, exactly just over a year ago, July 4th, Labour wins what was called at first a landslide election, winning almost 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons, but with only 33% of the popular vote. And we'll talk about that later, as maybe that wasn't really a landslide after all. So, Labour arrives, they describe financially what they call a 20 billion black hole in the public finances. And their goal since then in this year has been to try to resolve this black hole. But the main issue was that they promised that they wouldn't raise any major taxes. And so this naturally meant that they would have to go and look at what can we cut, basically. And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, decided that one of the main areas to do that would be welfare, for example. But this received a lot of backlash in the country, in the public, and in the Labour Party, which has meant recently that she had to U-turn on a number of these decisions.
Daniel, could you perhaps provide a bit of further insight into what actually happened with these welfare reforms? I'm sure many of our listeners saw it dominate the news headlines, but why was this so controversial?
It was so controversial because they were seen as targeting perhaps the most vulnerable group in society, which was the pensioners. So the pensioners have been using what's called the winter fuel payment to subsidise their energy costs, which have been particularly severe after the war in Ukraine and Donald Trump's tariffs. So the prospect that those would be reversed was deeply controversial, as you said, and naturally caused quite a lot of backlash in the Labour Party, which was really in part founded really to try and help support the weakest in society. So it was very poor publicity, and naturally they wanted to it received strong opposition in the Labour Party.
I want to go back just to the start last year, July 4th. You were saying that they only got 33% of the vote, but a landslide majority in the House of Parliament.
Yes.
Can we go a bit deeper into that, and can you sort of explain why that might not be the case in the next election, why that still might be the case? How did this sort of first past the post system enable that to happen? And do you see any changes coming up?
Yes, well, I think the problem lies in the fact that first past the post is essentially, I think, incapable of dealing with an election where you have so many parties with not really sufficient number of votes. I mean, traditionally, 33% of the vote, which is what Labour got, would not be considered sufficient to win a majority of seats in the House of Commons. And indeed, Jeremy Corbyn won an equal to or larger proportion of the votes in 2017 and 2019, but both times lost the election. So talking about next time, I think we might see a similar situation repeat in 2024, where the vote on the right was essentially split between Reform and Conservative, and that meant the Labour was able to ease in barely to dozens of constituencies across the country by very small vote shares, often like around 200, that kind of thing.
Daniel, you just mentioned there about this right-wing vote being split, and that is something that I think Farage sort of, in a way, sort of enjoyed, as a matter of fact, perhaps to sort of weaken the Conservatives. However, recent developments in the news and amidst the left wing in the UK have shown that there's a possibility, and I think actually likelihood, that Jeremy Corbyn and Zahra Sultana will form a new sort of breakaway socialist left-wing party. What threat do you think this poses to Labour?
I think that it could pose a significant threat, but I think it depends whether Jeremy Corbyn. I suppose the insinuation basically here is that Jeremy Corbyn might be able to do what Nigel Farage has done to the Conservative Party, which is basically to split off the more, I wouldn't say radical, but the more fringe
Hardliners.
Yes, the more hardline, more ideological elements of the part of the Conservative movement. He moved that to Reform. That's what Nigel Farage did. So there's a possibility Jeremy Corbyn would do the same with the Labour Party, and that the old socialists, they're called this sort of it's called this sort of momentum movement. That these people in this momentum movement might move towards Jeremy Corbyn's party. I've heard it say that that could make Labour lose about 30% of its vote share. On the extreme end, we'll have to see whether they can mimic what Reform's done to the Tories. But that'd be the worst case scenario for Labour, I think.
So if that does happen, and we have 4 parties with a decently split equal share of the votes, I think this is the big question that we've definitely been asking, John, to our guests for the last year. Are we going to see a Reform Conservative coalition in the next election? Do you think Jeremy Corbyn's party enables that coalition? Do you think it sort of forces the Tories, it backs them into a wall, basically saying, we need to couple up with Reform? Or do you think it actually helps the Conservative Party be a bit more independent of Reform?
I think that it would help the Tories be able to see themselves as more independent of Reform. Because I think from a Conservative point of view, this is probably the best news they've heard all year, in that the possibility that Labour's support might be fractured to the similar extent that the Conservative support has been fractured, they think might actually be good for them. They might be able to edge through in a number of these constituencies where Labour was able to just slip through because of the vote split between the Tories and Reform. So if the same was to happen with Labour and the Socialist Party, and then when you consider that their vote might also be split between Lib Dems and the Greens, then I think that would probably be the hope of the Conservatives, to be honest.
John, what do you think?
I'll say I agree with you there, Daniel. I think the Tories will have a sort of optimistic outlook on it because it does split Labour's vote. Corbyn's new party will attract these more ideological, hardline socialist members of the Labour Party, and also this sort of large pro-Palestine faction that exists. We can see it. There are protests currently erupting in the UK surrounding this. And I think Corbyn has always actually been a very popular politician amidst a certain group. He's always had a group which sort of look up to him in the same way that people on the far right look up to Farage. And I think that in certain Labour seats, especially those with a sort of larger sort of ideological hardline left perspective, Corbyn and Zahra Sultana's new party could pose a real threat to Labour. But it's literally almost a mirror image of Farage on the right, as you said there, Daniel. They're splitting the votes. Perhaps it will help Farage, a splitted Labour vote, to sort of transition into gaining more seats in Parliament at the next election. And I think it would. I think it will help him. But I think the Tories will like it, but then the Tories will also notice that it helps Farage. And it will help Farage attract more votes and more seats by splitting this vote. And actually, perhaps to mention, we can talk about this as well, Daniel, and it's the Green Party. They're apparently pretty dismal at the moment regarding this sort of socialist party that Corbyn may form. What are your opinions on them and their future in UK politics?
Well, it's interesting that we're discussing the Greens because there was a kind of theory going around, I suppose, a few years ago that climate change would basically mean that the Greens could end up being one of the largest parties and that Green parties around the world would rise. We just haven't seen that at all. And even though I think they won about 2 million votes actually in the general election, which was about a fair showing for the Greens, but I do think their base does overlap with what we might describe as this Corbynite possible socialist party that might arise. And so I think supporters of the Greens really, if they want a chance to actually implement their policies, they would be wise to switch their allegiance to the Corbyn party, because I think he is more of a rallying figure for the left, as opposed to these figures in the Green Party that no one's really heard of, like Carla Denyer, and I can't remember what the co-leader is called. They're that irrelevant. So That's what I would say. That would be my advice to the Greens.
Well, I have to agree with you on that point because, and we've discussed this previously on episode with Ian, politics about being popular. And the Greens at the moment, they're not popular as an organization, but they also don't have any leaders who have the potential to be popular. They
Yes.
don't have that sort of electric figure who can grab votes from different people, from different parties, different regions. And that Corbyn does have that. We can disagree with his policies, we can agree with his policies, we can agree with him as a person, disagree with him as a person. But what is undeniable about him is that he has this effect of being able to grab votes. He has the capacity of being able to look around the country and get votes from people. I want to challenge, though, a previous comment that both of you made, which is that this Corbyn party actually helps the Tories.
Okay.
I think it doesn't. I think it deeply hurts them. Because now, with sort of Farage and Reform rising in the local elections, we've seen a couple more wins. I think the split in the next general election will be roughly equal among Labour and the Conservatives, with Reform also being there and Jeremy Corbyn's party being there. I think this actually means that the Tories will be forced into a coalition against their will. Because this will be a shot at government for them, potentially, if Farage does well. And I don't see them partnering up with anyone else apart from Reform. So in the case that we get, which I think is quite probable, that no one has a majority of seats, if that happens, the Tories will be backed into a coalition with Reform. I don't see Labour necessarily partnering up with Jeremy Corbyn. I think their relationship is a bit strained. I definitely see the other side happening more.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I would say that the relationship between the Tories and Reform is far more strained, considering that Reform essentially destroyed the Conservative vote in the last election and probably will the next one. Like, if you consider that in 2024, Reform got 14% of the vote, Tories got 23%. If you were to add Reform's tally to the Tories' tally, then the Tories get more votes in 2024 than Labour, which completely undermines the whole idea that the Conservatives were deeply unpopular by 2024. So I think, in a sense, I do agree with you in that I think there will have to be some kind of coalition between some parties next election, because I can't see how first past the post will, unless, of course, first past the post somehow just allots party a majority, because it can sort of happen almost accidentally, where parties have received an almost equal amount of votes in a constituency and one of them just manages to take it. And if that happens across the board, then you can end up in absurd situations where a party with a very small amount of the vote gets a lot more seats, as Labour have done in 2024. So that's the question as to whether that will repeat again in 2029. I personally don't think it will, especially when you consider the rise of Reform and possibly the rise of the Socialist Party.
Yeah, I agree with you there,
John?
Daniel, as well. I think the biggest obstacle, actually, in many ways, to a Tory Reform coalition is whether Farage wants it, because he may not need it, simply because Reform UK, as we saw in the 2024 election, they were hugely popular across the nation. And I actually think that will only grow, purely because, in my opinion, the Conservatives aren't under the strongest leadership of Kemi Badenoch. She made all these slip-ups at the start when she just became leader, and she's still not provided any policies. On the other hand, whether you like them or not, Farage has got some clear policies, some clear ideas. Whether they can actually be implemented in government is another completely different question. But he has policies. He's offering a menu of what he wants. And I think that will attract voters. And I think the Tories will be ambivalent perhaps towards the new Socialist Party. They'll like how it splits the Labour vote and that left-wing vote, but they'll also recognise that they've got this problem of reform that has existed since 2024. And actually, the Conservatives, they're going to need something pretty fabulous, pretty out of the ordinary to compete with reform. And at the moment, perhaps we can move on to this now, Daniel. How do you think the Conservatives have performed this year? I think they could have done far better. What do you think?
Well, I mean, there's no other way to describe it other than basically a disastrous performance. Losing hundreds of councillors in the May local elections. I think it is possible that the party really struggles to continue in the same way that the Liberal Party after World War One really saw all of its voters move towards the more radical Labour Party in the early 21st century. So if that repeats with the Conservative vote moving so much towards reform that the party can no longer continue, it's frankly possible. I think that probably won't happen. I think the Conservatives will continue. And I think we will see a situation where Labour just keep sneaking in, basically, because of how divided the vote on the right is. Unless, of course, Reform is able to meet the kind of magic number of the low 30s in popularity. And we are seeing Nigel Farage reach that kind of level of support in the polls. Because if we think that Labour was able to get a 65% of the seats with only 33% of the vote, and the fact that Reform's polling at 30% right now, if Reform can get that up to 32, 33, 34, then we could see them get a Reform landslide out of nowhere. And I think that's definitely a possibility that we have to consider.
I want to ask you something there on the May local elections. Can you just, for our viewers, a quick refreshment? What are the numbers? What happened? What are the takes from that?
Okay, well, first, a bit of context on what these local elections actually are, because there's so many layers of government in Britain that it can be quite confusing as to what's actually going on. So, what people were voting on there was quite a lot of these, basically, what we call like sort of county councils, because they alternate. Every local elections, it's a different set of elections in different parts of the countries for these different layers. And these local councils handle basically local issues, and people's parents will pay things like council taxes and this kind of thing. County councils handle roads, schools.
To give us
Overview of the
a
local
different picture, I just wanted to ask, just for a clarity point
What
for
are
our
the
viewers.
results? Yeah.
No. Just these county councils operate in the way sort of in Europe a mayor would operate. For the people who are not from the UK,
Yes, for the international listeners.
if you're from the States or from continental Europe or from anywhere else, mostly, you would have a mayor doing things that the county council does.
I think that's
Correct?
a fair comparison. County councils are basically just if you split a mayor into a plural group of people, they're really doing the same job as a mayor. It's just not centralised that way. We do have some mayors, for example, Mayor of London, Mayor of Greater Manchester, and the idea of centralising it more around mayors who would be more powerful in these councils is definitely a direction in which we're heading, and it's definitely a plan of, I think, the Labour government, to be honest. But that would be a good comparison, I think. Yes.
Oh, so
what are the
Daniel,
results? What happened?
So the results, right. Labour did badly. The Conservatives did terribly. Although you do have to remember that part of the reason the Conservatives did so badly was because a lot of the councils that were up for election were councils that Boris Johnson won at the peak of his popularity back in 2021. So it was always inevitable that the Conservatives were going to lose a lot of these council seats. But even when you take into that account, they still did very poorly, and Reform did really, really well. Obviously, they basically didn't have a single council before this, so everything was a gain. It's impossible for them to lose when you have nothing to start with. So they did gain an enormous amount, really even taking really key Labour, very left-wing strongholds in kind of the old mining areas, like, for example, Durham County Council going to Reform. These are really astonishing things, and I think Labour should be really worried about that they could end up being a one-term government if their natural base of support, especially in the north of England, gravitates towards reform. It's definitely a possibility, and it has been reflected in these local elections. The question is whether it can be converted at a general election. And it's often said by political analysts and people like that people vote in general elections very differently how they would vote in local elections. And local elections might be seen as almost a protest vote, where the government will do particularly badly. People just want to get across their dissatisfaction. They might not necessarily vote against the government in the general election.
was going to say there, Daniel, I agree with you. I think perhaps to sort of use a football analogy, Farage was sort of the man on the right wing, and he scored this meteoric goal in these local elections, one could say. I think that was probably the highlight of his 2025 in many ways.
Yes, definitely. Especially with him winning the by-election in Helsby.
I just want to go a bit deeper into this local election, though.
Yes.
Is because a lot of people in 2024 were talking about how the Lib Dems sort of prepared their groundwork almost at the local election that delivered them roughly 60 seats in the general election. Is that possible for reform? Do we think this is the first layer in Farage's and Reform's sort of ascension to more seats in government?
I mean, it's very hard to predict because we're probably 4 years away from the general election. But I would say, I think Reform may have peaked. I say hesitantly, but I think Reform may have peaked in popularity. Maybe you'll both disagree with me on that. Because if you look at the polls, they've reached 30% with Reform. It's kind of fluctuating between 30 and 29. I don't really see Labour becoming even more unpopular than it already is. I'm not sure how it's possible for a current government to get worse than the current 23% that they're polling right now. So in terms of the numbers, I'd say hesitantly, unless the Conservatives collapse further, that I think Reform may have peaked and that I'm not sure they can get above 30%. Can they win an election with 30%? Maybe. It really just depends on what first past the post does, because it can't really handle this amount of parties on almost an equal footing. It will do strange things, basically, is the issue.
Yes, and sort of thinking about what you said there, Daniel, because that did make me think that they could almost just plateau Reform in a way, because now
Yes.
it's become a reality for them governing in many ways through these local elections. And people are going to witness what a Reform local government is like and whether they're actually very good at governing. And in my opinion, I think that will be a major obstacle to Reform and Farage. I think Farage is an amazing publicist. Is he an amazing politician and political leader? I don't think probably he is, actually. I think he's got the media game sorted out, but the actual sort of political game, probably not.
I would probably describe him as a bit of a charismatic kind of demagogue figure. He's able to rally enormous amounts of people to him, but when he's actually tasked with governing, I think he might actually become quite bored. I think he's in love with the game, but I don't know whether he's actually interested in ruling. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to, because people have said he's running a kind of cult of personality almost. And it kind of depends how much of his personality is actually interested in governing at all. So,
yeah, I think he, as you said, I think he likes the idea of the chase. But yeah, perhaps not.
Yeah.
yes.
To finish off with, perhaps we can sort of delve into some of the recent news. And we mentioned it at the start, but these are the rather tumultuous few weeks that Starmer has had on the front bench. He had Rachel Reeves crying in Parliament. He had this welfare bill, which I think left him just wishing for the summer holiday ahead. Can you perhaps comment on what has happened these last few weeks for Starmer? He's recently seen Macron as well.
Yes. So, to begin with, Rachel Reeves crying. That broke the headlines. Everyone was saying the reason why she was crying, even though she said it was for personal reasons, everyone else said it was just she just had such a bad time in Parliament with these welfare cuts, which the government has proposed and has had to U-turn on despite their 170-seat majority because their own MPs don't support it. They think the government's become too right-wing, essentially. Why do I think she was crying? I think that's probably the reason why she did burst into tears, in a way almost like Scooby in Scooby-Doo, who often bursts into tears in these kind of extraordinary emotional scenes. And I think that is what has happened to her in this case. I don't believe her story that it was for personal reasons. Her excuse is that for ordinary people in the public, when they have a bad day, it's not on television. But then I think she has to recognise that she's not an ordinary person. You know, if Joe Schmo has a bad day, he's just Joe Schmo. She's not Joe Schmo. And she's chosen that life. She's chosen to be the second most important public servant in the nation. And I think in that role, you have to behave as someone who is above that kind of crass show of emotion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you
That's
said
what I'd say.
there, in a rather sort of powerful analogy there, Daniel, Reeves crying did just sort of symbolise this dismal state for Labour over those past few weeks. But looking to the future as well, what do you think's next for Starmer? How will he sort of attract this popularity which he's recently lost?
Well, I think if I was Starmer, there's a clear way out of the current mess, which is basically he needs to have a reset in government completely. He needs to throw away this manifesto pledge that he wouldn't raise taxes. Evident he does, considering how poorly the economy is doing right now. So the only way to do that is he needs to have a new chancellor who can restore credibility in the markets, because Rachel Reeves has just upset the markets to quite a considerable extent, especially with the cost of our debt and that kind of thing for the economists. We'll know about more. And I think that would be what I would do if I was Starmer. I think he also really needs to go really, really hard on migration. If you're going to get the reform vote, he needs to prove that he's credible on migration. Currently, he has not. This scheme he's devised with Macron, I think, is essentially just a show. It involves a few boats going back here and there to France, lots of nice pictures to go on the television, but really, is there much substance to it? I doubt it. So that's what I would do if I was Starmer. Will he do it? I think he will do none of the things I have suggested, because I think he has very poor political instincts, if I'm perfectly honest. Considering he's only been in Parliament for 10 years, he's really just a newbie. So he needs some more experience, I'd say.
My question is, you said you'd bring a new chancellor. Who can that be? Who in the Labour Party at the moment sort of is up there for that role? Who can actually do the job?
So I think the conflict would be between, from the figures of the soft left, you got figures like Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary. You've got Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, although, frankly, I don't think she'll be perceived as having the intelligence for the role of being Chancellor. So I don't think it'll be her. So I think it'll probably most likely be Yvette Cooper, who is the current Home Secretary. She's ran for Labour leader before. I think she was actually beaten by Jeremy Corbyn in 2015 in that leadership election then. So she is a big figure in the Labour Party. And I think she probably would be that choice. It would also avoid any speculation that the reason for getting rid of Rachel Reeves was sexism, because you'd be replacing one female chancellor with another. So that'd be another plus for Starmer, which I think he might go for, to be honest. I certainly don't see Rachel Reeves being chancellor at the next election. I'm willing to stand by that prediction. Rachel Reeves will not be chancellor in the 2029 general election. That's my prediction.
So you heard it here first. I do agree with that. I think Starmer has got a brilliant opportunity for the Labour Party, and he may be, as you said there, Daniel, wasting it with Rachel Reeves.
Thank you very much. Fabulous discussion today with Daniel and John. And again, many thanks, Daniel, for coming on. It's really interesting to sometimes be able to sort of go a bit more holistically around politics with someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And as always, if you enjoyed the episode, please do leave a comment, leave us a review, and be ready for another sort of politics-related episode coming very, very soon. We're very excited for that one as well. See you all next week.
See you then.
Thank you for having me on, John and Dejan.